So for those who are just attending, so we don't have a Q&A function. There is going to be a question and answer period near the end. So if you have questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. And then near the end, as moderator, I will look through the questions, filter them if need be, and then put them to the panel. In terms of what's going to happen today, so I'll introduce myself, the panel, also going to do a bit of a statement on our current colonial times, which is a bit messy. Then instead of just jumping right into a bunch of questions and answers, we're actually going to, or I'm going to have just a brief discussion about some facts that we feel folks should know in the context of adoption. And obviously a contentious part of adoption is what's known as transracial adoption. And then the panelists themselves are going to be answering some questions. And then I know we're used to just panels where people answer questions, then you move on. We are trying to actually have this kind of be more of a discussion, so we might not make our way through all of the questions. Who knows? We just hope to have a generative discussion. So in terms of myself, if you're not familiar with who I am, my name is Josh Lamers. My pronouns are he, they. I am the executive lead of the Collective of Child Welfare Survivors. I myself have been through the system, so foster care, then the process of the transracial adoption. I've been doing this work for quite some time, child welfare work, and then CCWS for the past 3 years. If you're not familiar with the Collective of Child Welfare Survivors, or again, CCWS, we support children and families dealing with child protection, primarily those who are Black, Indigenous, and racialized. Two of the main key areas are we provide individual advocacy for families and children, and so that can be one-on-one, and we also run community spaces in organizations. So if you're interested in connecting with us, whether that be community workshops or whether that be people who might need support from us, by all means feel free to reach out. Before we begin, we love the funder acknowledgements. So we acknowledge our funder, Ontario Trillium Fund Youth Innovation Stream. Thank you. And so the other acknowledgement that I would like to give is to the Black Legal Action Center. For folks who are not familiar with grant structures, we had to have an organizational mentor, and they've been a great organization for us for the past 3 years as a mentor organization, and that relationship is coming to a close as this grant life term of the grant is finishing. So I just wanted to say a big thank you to them. So in terms of this, our conversation, the panelists themselves might use different language, but for you folks who are listening, you might notice I use the term family policing system rather than child welfare. And that term comes out of the work of folks who have worked against what's known as child welfare, the family policing system. And it's meant to acknowledge the ways in which, child welfare often works with the education system, psychiatric system, the welfare state, to actually police families, primarily those who are Black, Indigenous, and racialized. And then, again, it's in our name, child welfare survivors, but we use that term instead of youth in care because we do not actually think this is a system that doles out care, because if that was the case, we would not be having this panel. So again, the panelists might use different language. That's just for yourselves as I'm the moderator and as you hear me talking. So again, so we don't do land acknowledgements here at CCWS because it's been about a decade of land acknowledgements, and I would like folks to look at the state of the world and ask yourselves if those effective. Instead, I think it's more incumbent upon us as folks who are working against the system, or for folks who espouse working in favor of social justice, rather to acknowledge the ways that we're entangled with colonialism, both as survivors and perpetrators, right? And as we do so, especially in this context of so-called Canada, we have these constant state commitments to Indigenous communities. Meanwhile, Canada is constantly decimating Indigenous people's lands. Canada is constantly underfunding Indigenous communities. And Canada has its hand in global colonization, right? So from the Caribbean all the way to the continent of Africa, Canada seems to be pretty good at getting involved in destroying other people's lands. And so it's important as we think through what a future looks like, It's very important, especially in this time, you know, prime example, Palestine. We are seeing how far a state is willing to go to colonize in this, you know, current moment. And so it's important that we be aware of and work against this kind of violence. Now, shifting to the facts of adoption, and this is, you know, where I'm going to kind of be chatting at y'all for a little bit, and then we'll have the lovely panelists chime in, so you just get to hear my voice. Woo! So if you're new to the conversation of adoption, it's important to know that historically adoption had nothing to do about caring for kids, right? It had everything to do with white men's property. That white men who did not have an heir wanted the capacity to still pass along their property or keep the family name going. And so came along adoption, and it was often rarely used. And it's important to understand that like this was centuries ago, but we know centuries ago there was particular communities who were not considered communities. They were considered property or in the way, right? Black and Indigenous communities. So in this conversation of adoption and how it functioned and who it was used for, it was clearly never intended for Black, Indigenous, and racialized people. Now, that is not to say that Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities did not have different ways of forming families, right? But it was not through this legal mechanism of adoption, because that was entirely impossible because we were not considered human via law, right? Whatever law that was. Now shifting, you know, I guess more so in recent history, more so the 1900s, it's also important to know that our family policing legislation in Ontario, which really did set the stage internationally, our family policing legislation or child welfare laws were the key thinkers behind it was a white woman eugenicist, right? Who believed that a particular kind of person is a person, and that fell within racial lines. You know, there was ableist language or problematic language against disabled communities, and part as to how she conceptualized who needs help, how do we help them, do we give them money, do we give them care, who do we even see as a child, right? And so at this time, you know, Ontario is also, if you look at the history, Ontario social workers, white women, were often working in connection to white women social workers in New York and in the UK, right? And so this is why I say Ontario actually, in many ways, set the stage internationally for how we would come to understand adoption. But then Canada's been able to hide and be like, we didn't cause all these problems, when in fact we did. Well, not me, because, you know, I was just subject to it. And so the practice, and I begin this conversation with transracial adoption, just because it tends to be the most contentious in this conversation of adoption. But when we talk about the abolition of adoption, we are also talking about what's considered in-racial adoption, which can be and is just as violent, right? But when we're looking at kind of the public conversations around adoption, it was deeply entwined with transracial adoption. And so many people don't know this, but transracial adoption actually, like the first transracial adoption globally started here in Ontario. It was in Toronto, and it was in the 1940s. And then in the 1950s and then in the 1960s, the Toronto Social Planning Committee got together because they were like, there's just too many damn Black kids in this system, right? And all of these Black kids are in this system because Canada has set has an anti-Black socioeconomic state, right? Black people can't work in certain jobs, and again, it's not just Black communities, Indigenous communities, racialized communities are pushed into particular kinds of labor in Canada and in Ontario. And of course, that then impacts if you can afford housing, if you can afford this and that and the third. And then, of course, if you can't, you are considered neglectful, and often children are being apprehended. So you have a lot of children present in this, Black children, Indigenous children in the system. And so in the 1950s, the Toronto Social Planning Committee, alongside some folks over in Montreal called the Montreal Caring Society, and then the Child Welfare League in New York, got together and they were like, well, how do we convince white people to adopt these Black kids, right? So essentially these people were already admitting that in fact no white person wanted these Black kids, right? And part of that had to do with the fact that white people, like the presence of white children in the system was less because white people were more willing to keep their children. For example, white single mothers, it was no longer seen as a social ill to be a white single mother, so they were more likely to keep their children. You also had that, like the growth of contraception, and so the maintenance of the white family was more solid. So you had more of these Black kids, and white people were not really interested in taking these Black kids. And so the Toronto Social Planning Committee, with all of these groups, decided, okay, how do we create an effective propaganda campaign? And that's what they did, right? So they went across Ontario and they created slides to try to sell these children to these white communities. And while they were doing this, in the very documents, right? These are government documents. I actually have the books beside me if folks don't believe me. In their very government documents, they admit, they're like, we have no research to back this as a good decision. They openly say this. They say, and in fact, they say that there was a researcher who said, you can barely research this topic because how do you decide what's considered successful and for who, right? But then they say in the very government report, we're going to do it anyways. I think something that's important to note is in the very first chapter of this report is the mention of how costly it is to have a child in care per day, right? So it's very clear that the government understood adoption not as something about caring for children, but about something as getting rid of the cost off of the state. And while they were doing these, I guess they would consider it consultations, but they were propaganda campaigns. And they're having conversations with these white communities. The white people themselves are saying, okay, well, let's say I'm willing to adopt a Black child. I would not be okay with a Black child marrying my white kid. And so the white people themselves were starting to point out the illogics. And while this is happening, and so CAS workers or social workers at the time were actually against the practice, and this was being acclaimed as an anti-Black, posture of these CAS workers, which it probably was. But the researchers and the government was using that to ignore the fact that also what the CAS workers were doing is informing the white parents of the kinds of racism and struggle these children would face in the homes that they were being placed in, right? And so the parents started reporting, and then the government researchers said to the CS workers, stop telling the parents about the problems because you're not selling it well, right? So this was about propaganda. None of it had to do with the children themselves. And so when we then forward in time, one of the, sorry, someone keeps calling my phone. When we move forward in time, one of the issues becomes the fact that in the context of Canada, we did not have any laws against the practice of this kind of adoption, right? So often we look to the US, we talk about the Jim Crow laws, and we forget that Canada functioned in a very specific way with its anti-Blackness. We were just as overt, but in different ways. So in Canada, because we did not have any laws that went against the practice of transracial adoption, the change in practice to allow for transracial adoption was an institutional decision. That meant there was no legal oversight. That meant that there was no political party debate in the legislature. That meant that there was no community consultation, not that they ever work or are effective, but there was no community consultation, and there was no open public debate. So what this meant is the practice of transracial adoption was entirely informed, one, off the knowledge of the white workers, and two, off the interests of the state and the people involved in this research and report, right? And so there was no thinking, well, how do we evaluate properly a white household? What might we consider the well-being of a Black child or an Indigenous child or a racialized child? How do we even at a basic level actually start to develop an understanding of how people are meant to parent children in general, right? And just in the context of adoption. So there's none of this. It's just a bunch of people said that let's try to clear up this problem. And so what this means is there's very little, you know, public thinking into this practice. But what you do get, and I think Black people are, and Indigenous people and racialized people are very used to this, where the state will make a decision and then they will try to research to justify that decision. And so throughout time, people might hear, well, people say that there's this research, there's so much research and literature that says it's effective and successful. And so, you know, I didn't mention it in my talking about myself, but I'm doing my PhD in this topic. And so I've read a lot, despite there not actually being a lot, but I've read a lot of research and literature. And so some of the very first reports and research was done in the 1960s in the US by the Child Welfare League. And of course, headed by white women. And you would be shocked to find out that a lot of the research that is done on adoption and transracial adoption, it is not the adoptees, the children themselves, who are being researched and who are answering questions. It is the parents. So the researcher is coming and the parents are reporting on how successful this adoption is, answering very specific questions. If the adoptee is engaged, the adoptee is usually a child, the adoptee is not actually usually interviewed. Instead, the adoptee is asked to answer specific questions, standardized questions, right? And so that's very important because there's this current public narrative, especially in Ontario, as they're pushing adoption again, that these adoptions are successful. And this loops back to what a researcher said in the 1950s. It is very difficult to come to a definition of success that you then research and try to justify this decision. And they did it anyways. And so they keep saying, well, there's research, reports, and literature. And as you'll come to find out maybe on this panel, there's a very different experience and opinion on adoption. And so I'm going to stop there. Again, the reason why I wanted to do that is, you know, I think sometimes we have these conversations and people who are in the audience will think, well, this is just a personal opinion, right? And so now you're going to have folks answer questions, that these panelists answer questions in the context of this history, right? Because this history is just factual, right? If the government didn't want us to know, they shouldn't have written it down and put it in a library. So with that being said, we're going to transition to our wonderful panelists whose bios I have found very quickly. So I'm going to start with introducing Zyra. So Zyra Epps is a Black same-race adoptee and spent time in foster care before being adopted. Zyra is the founder of the podcast Adoptees Crossing Lines, where she has honest conversations about being an adoptee and the industry as a whole. Zyra is an abolitionist and is passionate about social issues and using her voice to amplify marginalized communities. So that is Zyra. Then we have Harrison. So Harrison Mooney is a best-selling memoirist, amazing memoir, and award-winning journalist from British Columbia, Canada. His debut memoir, oh my God, that's a word. His debut memoir, Invisible Boy, has been shortlisted for 2 BC and Yukon Book Prizes, the prestigious Hurston and Wright Legacy Award, and was the winner of the 2023 Rakuten Kobo Emerging Writer Prize for Nonfiction. I might have butchered that first word. Harrison's work has also appeared in the New York Times, the Vancouver Sun, the Guardian, Yahoo, and Maclean's. He lives in East Vancouver with his family and family dog, Bootsy. I think I got Bootsy's name right. And next we have Ashley Ash, or Ash. Ash is South Asian and spent the first 12 years of her life with the Children's Aid Society of Toronto before being made a Crown Ward. Shortly after, she went through racial displacement through adoption into a white family. Ashley has spoken at numerous speaking engagements to young people involved in child welfare, adoptive parents, social workers, and lawyers, and judges involved in child welfare. Ash currently holds a Bachelor of Social Work from Toronto Metro University and a Juris Doctor from the University of Windsor, Faculty of Law, and became a member of the Ontario Bar in 2023, and currently practices Indigenous child welfare law. Ash is also one of our CCWS board members and co-creators. and previously worked at various organizations such as the Office of the Ontario Child Advocate, specialty legal aid clinics, and she's also a national award-winning writer who uses her prose to communicate messages important to her and her community. So that is Ash. So you have a very wordy panel, pretty much. So to our first question, so our first question is going to have Zyra answering first. So the first question is, says, this online panel is called Taking a Life. So with that in mind, what do you think adoption took from you, and what do you think adoption gave you, if anything at all? And when you consider what was given to be unconditional? And for folks, I'm going to type the question in the chat as well.
Yeah, first, thanks to you for hosting this panel and for having me. Very grateful to be here. But to answer this question, I would say that adoption, it's more like, what didn't adoption take from me? I feel like it took everything from me. My identity, my name, my medical history, my family, my sense of safety, the opportunity to grieve with my siblings. And as far as what adoption gave me, I think it just gave me the burden of never being enough to a family who I was always a backup choice for. I was never their first option. And so I don't think anything that I received from the people who adopted me was unconditional, including their so-called love, because the minute I didn't fit into their boxes or their parameters, they made sure to dispose of me. And so when I think about adoption, I don't really think about anything that it gave to me. I really think a lot about what it took from me and how I was constantly forced to be put into this box or to act a certain way, in order to keep myself as safe as possible, and ultimately just to keep myself alive in the care of strangers.
Thank you for that. Harrison, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Well, yeah. Okay, I just want to echo what Zyra said. Like, yeah, yes, ditto. Yeah, I've been thinking about this question since I got this agenda, and like, if I can think of anything that my adoption gave me that I'm happy I have, like maybe my white voice on the phone. Like, I feel like that's been helpful as a journalist. You get better answers when they think you're white on the phone. But like other than that, like it's all been bad stuff, man. Like just complex trauma, like existential terror, like a weird loneliness. Um, I feel like I've just recently really started like connecting with like other adoptees in the adoptee discourse, and it's been really remarkable to find out that all of these weird complexes that I deal with are quite common, you know. So I'm not really happy that I have any of these complexes, but it has been comforting to know that I'm not the only one at the very least. um like I feel like my adoption has just it's given me a bunch of stuff I have to get over, and a bunch of stuff I have to recover. I guess maybe a compelling story, but I do think that I would have preferred like an internal peace. um and as far as what was given, I mean, unconditional, I have seen no evidence of that. Even when my adoptive parents were telling me that the love that they were showing me, which didn't feel like love, was unconditional, I mean, it felt conditional then. And now that I've put out this book and they have effectively disappeared from my life, it seems pretty clear that that love was always conditional. And the main condition was that I never look back, never really look at what happened to me, or acknowledge what it might mean for me or for them or for the culture. But I did that. So I know that it wasn't unconditional.
Thank you. And it's just, again, for folks who might have just entered, we're going to kind of try to like weave all of our responses together after each panelist is gone. Ash.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, I've been trying to like grapple with this question too ever since I saw it. I think I have a really interesting experience of having being adopted twice. So like first internationally in like not what I would necessarily call a formal adoption, more of like a baby napping situation maybe. But when I think about that one, and I think there's a number of things I can really point to for that one. Like obviously being taken out of India. I mean, that was a physical removal from my place of birth, from my culture, from people who looked like me, and from my family who was there and my extended family. And so I think in terms of that adoption, like there are losses like I can't even fathom right now or like fully come to terms with almost. And then in my second adoption, which happened when I was 12 out of the child welfare system here in Ontario, I think there was again this kind of loss when I think about, you know, giving up where I lived, where I had grew up, like which was Scarborough, Toronto, Ontario, Canada. My name, like I changed my last name because that was expected. And then in the process of all of this, like something happened with my documents, so I had to change my birthday. And I think I just remember at one point like getting so upset and just saying like, what else do like I have to give like to for this to happen? And like I've already given so much. And I think when I think about if adoption gave me anything at all, like I think there are certain things that have flowed as a result of my adoption, but not necessarily adoption was the thing that gave it to me, if that makes sense. Like I think one of the one things that I do point to that came out of my adoption was my adoptive mother now, she said or one of her plans when I was adopted was for me to have a godmother who looked like me and who was from India, so I could have that kind of cultural connection in a way. And that is really like my extended family. Like when I talk about my family, like those are the people I talk about. My cousins are like her family. They are the loves of my life. Like, so I think that's something that flowed out of my adoption, but like wasn't like a result. I don't know, it's hard to say, but do I think of any of these things as unconditional? Like no, because when I think about it, like adoption in many ways is like, and I'm a lawyer, so like it's for me, it's like it's a legal contract. Like we have legislation around it. It's a legal way to take on a child. So I think from the outset, like you're talking about this contractual relationship and all contracts come with terms and conditions. And so, you know, you're going to be raised by this family, but you know, there's this understanding of the child you have to be in order for that to work. And, you know, we know that there are kids who are seen as adoptable and those who are not. And the CAS will tell you that themselves. And so they make that very clear to you, or at least they did to me. So I think, yeah, I don't think of any of this as unconditional. I think of all the loss that's happened, and I think of like the one good thing that maybe came as a result of that. So that's my answer. Sorry.
Don't apologize. Before I maybe step in, does anyone want to piggyback? Did anything like pop in your head, or should I moderate? Okay, I'll moderate. So I think while you folks were talking, and I realized somehow we're early on the schedule, which has never happened. So while you folks were talking, I think what is evident is loss. And I think, you know, what's interesting is how like almost everyone said there really wasn't a gain, which is so against the public narrative of adoption, right? Not only like aren't you going to get a better life, but you're going to have stability. You won't have to move around foster homes or group homes, you know, you'll get to do programs. And so, you know, and I'm sure all these things that I'm sure all four of us, if we said to our adoptive families, you gave me nothing, they would start listing off these things that we're all like, welcome to doing basic parenthood. You were actually supposed to do more than that. And so I hear like how loss is just not even the undercurrent, like it's the main event of adoption. And you know, and I was listening to like which is why I put the question forward, is like listening to you folks trying to or thinking through this grappling of giving. And I think that's important because I think that also shows, you know, to the public the ways in which we actually as adoptees are manipulated into finding something that is giving, right? Because, you know, we have to like, it's not even a crumb, we have to find like one thing, or we find one thing and then we're kind of told to treat it as a whole meal, as if though we've just stepped into the buffet. You know, Harrison, I find it interesting what you said around like the white voices with the journalists, because I think I get that too. Like, you know, I think my landlord's kept me so long because he thinks I'm a white boy named Josh. And so we're just gonna run with it. And it also, I think, shows that like the kind of survival strategies that we've like had to learn in these contexts of adoption. And I don't think that's just transracial adoption. I think, you know, for in-racial adoption, I do think there's a particular kind of person, as a Black person or as Indigenous racialized person, but more so as a Black person in this context. There's a particular kind of person as a parent who's allowed to adopt, right? And anti-Blackness and whiteness functions in all households, although not all households maybe want to admit it. And so I think the ways in which adoptees, because we know we've been put here, and we're supposed to perform in this space, right? And perform as if though we've been given something great. Well, then we're always hyper aware of how we navigate this, what we consume, what we internalize. And then, you know, kind of as Ash said, it's like, but then we start to realize that everything has been taken, right? And something else that I heard is kind of the ambiguity, or how ambiguity is able to cause all of this loss, right? We're unsure of, a document is now missing, this person's out of our life. Who do we even grieve if we don't even know who's behind the paperwork, right? How many cousins did we have? How many siblings do we have? Is the aunt next door? Is she down the street, or is she in another country, right? And so there's this, how ambiguity gets to, or how adoption gets to function off of all of this ambiguity. And again, it's us who deals with the loss. It's us who deals with that. And, you know, and really for the adoptive parents, it just makes them anxious, right? Because heaven forbid that family that we were saved from actually be a family that we actually could have lived happily in. So those are things that I'm hearing. Before I move on to the next question, is there anyone want to jump in?
Yeah. That ambiguity is just so disorienting, and it's, you know, it's amazing to me. Like after meeting, you know, some members of my biological family, like I still have this sense that I'm not part of that family either. You know, it's like, okay, well, I'm kind of a guest over there. You know, I'm like, remember on Step by Step, there was the guy who lived outside and he would just come into the kitchen sometimes. Like I just like I've always felt like that guy. I'm like, oh yeah, like I'm like the fun comic relief who's part of the family. And so, you know, when I kind of try to, you know, in my mind, pour it into this other family, like I still feel apart from it. And, you know, I've found that just kind of apartness is, you know, like it's just like it's my most common feeling. You know, in the book, I talked about, you know, this feeling that I didn't quite exist. You know, it's like I guess I'm here, but like, do I exist in the same way that other people exist? And you know, since then, finding out that that's a common feeling, I mean, how freaking horrible is that? Like, if we have this many people all testifying to the fact that like this causes like a measurable existentialism, like we can there's data on it. You know, like it's existentialism, like our ontology, it's all this pie in the sky stuff, but then like, you know, the facts are there. And I just think like the most difficult thing for me about my adoption is this sense that I'm just nothing about me is firm. You know, that I have to, you know, even my own name. It's like, okay, well, I guess I'll hold on to this name, but it turns out I had another name. Like, well, can I claim that name? Like, is that my real name? What is a real name? You know, and I feel fuzzy. I feel fuzzy all the time. And it just makes me angry. You know, when I met my biological brother and he talked about, you know, like a night that he and his mom had to sleep under the table at a Denny's. I tell this story all the time. He and our mom, see, I mean, there I'm doing it. They had to sleep under the table at a Denny's, and I said to him, like, well, weren't you scared? And he was like, no, I was with my mom. And I just, the idea that you could have that kind of safety, like that kind of certainty, that kind of like under the table at a Denny's, like I'm in the right place. I'm jealous of that. And it just, it feels unfair to be given that kind of existential crisis, existential terror, and then just sent off on your own with, you know, nobody to really fix that for you. Anyway, that's my rant. Someone else go.
No, we love the rant. Anyone else want to join in?
Yeah, I guess like just that feeling of like walking around with no roots, like totally like unconnected, is not a good feeling. It's not, you know, and this is like a question you'll ask later on, but it has impacts on you. And I think that feeling of like being totally disconnected, but then like also like in your, I think in your body, like remembering certain things and like just I don't know, it's just interesting to me like what your body could still remember, but then like grieve without actually like experiencing it or like having like a good memory of it. And yeah, I just think like it's such a terrible feeling to walk around like that. And I think um you know, I remember feeling jealous of like my friends who had been in the care system, but like still had like known who their birth family was and was like able to email them like when they were 20 and be like, hey. And it's just like, you know, that feeling of like never being able to have that option, I think is very hard. And I think is really like a terrible, terrible loss for a person. Yeah.
Zyra, I saw you unmute.
Yeah, I just was gonna say, just echoing both of y'all's sentiments, just this feeling of being untethered, and just not being attached to anything is one of the worst feelings I've ever experienced in my life. And Ashley, we're talking about, being jealous of your friends who are also in care, who had somebody to, talk to, and, not being able to have that experience. And I resonate with that maybe from a different perspective because both my biological parents are dead. And so I didn't get that reunion that a lot of people got. Like I'm just out here trying to figure out how to survive. And granted, I've connected to like other family and things like that, but not being able to connect to a parent has been really, really hard. And then to have been adopted into such an abusive environment and being raised by such abusive people, it just feels like I lost all the way around sometimes.
And like, you know, that's heartbreaking to hear. And the fact is, like, adoption actually, it's not even a feeling. Like, you did lose all the way around, and adoption caused it. And like, I think that's the hard part for all of this is, again, like how adoption is sold is stability. And yet all of you in various different ways talked about instability, right? And I think and that instability isn't even a feeling. Our lives, your lives were just unstable, and not because of you, but because of an entire system. And with that being said, sorry, I think now, kind of as Ash said, it's a good segue into the second question. And Harrison, you'll start us. Oh my God. Okay, we're breathing. So Harrison, you'll start us off. And so question 2 asks, how has being adopted affected you as an adult? This can be relationships, career and life choices, how you parent, or physical, mental, spiritual, and or emotional impacts, etc.
Yeah. How much time do you have?
Our therapist could say it's gonna take some time.
Take some time. Yeah, I think that like, every single one of those is something that I could say something about. Like for me, I wrote this book. I mean, I guess now it's been like 4 years ago. And like that was in a lot of ways the first time that I really looked at what had happened to me. And later on I heard that phrase, the fog, and the idea of coming out of the fog, and realized that, like that's what that book was. I kind of did it in real time. I came out of that fog, and um I today I did a memoir writing workshop with these teens, and we were talking about like stories where you've injured yourself, and one of the common themes was how they didn't actually feel the pain until they looked at it. And I think that that's been something that's really played out in my life with my adoption is, I started to look at it, and then man, did I ever feel that pain. And so I mean, these last 4 or 5 years have been like, it's been a complete collapse and rebuild. I have like I've gone through a horrible depression. I've done a lot of therapy. And I've really just kind of had to reconstitute my sense of myself. And it feels like, that's not supposed to happen. I think that like I'm supposed to be I think past young adulthood and past these formative years, you grow and you change all the time, but like you don't deflate and then have to rebuild. And I have had to do that. And I've had to engage with a childhood that I somehow didn't engage with while I was living it. And I just yeah, I feel like it's been in every facet of my life. It's been, my difficulty committing in a relationship. It's been the way that just even like the sounds that my kids make when they're whiny triggers me because I think about how like I would have gotten hit for that. Or love would have been consciously withheld for that. It's been, yeah, I mean, I could talk forever about it, but I really feel like um it's been like every aspect of my life has been touched by an adoption that again I really didn't engage with while I was growing up. um yeah, I will defer to someone else at this point. Come back to that.
Okay, we got time. Ash.
Yeah, I mean, like, do you want to run down like all the diagnoses? I don't know. But
Not asking for your medical charts, okay, everyone?
no, I mean, like, it's a really important question, and I think it's one that's not like just starting to be researched. And I think when I think about it and when I thought about this question, like there's no doubt in my mind that your relationships with yourself, with others are informed by all the other important relationships in your life. Um, for me, I will say there's been an impact, I think, in terms of like this pressure that I've put on myself my whole life to be this like perfect child, and that came, having the perfect grades and like having like a great job and then like being successful at all times. And I think at one point, just really recently I started to think about that and say like, did I do any of this for myself, or like was I in pursuit of this like person who I thought was gonna make my parents happy and who I thought was gonna be loved and who I thought was gonna be wanted, and um who was gonna like be that person that allowed me to survive like all this time. But has any of it like made me happy? Like that's a big question that I always have for myself. And it's I think it's hard. I think like I live on the margins of like, I don't know, like I always tell people like I feel like at any given moment in time, like I'm always in like this process of like grieving and like always feeling like a certain level of sadness. And it's like hard to explain that to people and to have them understand that, or have them understand what that means. They're like, oh, but you're high functioning and you're at work and you're doing this and and it's like, yes, but at any given point in time, I'm unbelievably like sad.
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't know how to explain that to folks and have them understand what that means, but that's how I feel personally. Um, and then I think like just in terms of like relationships or, relationships with others, I think it's interesting. Like I think we were talking about ambiguity, and like I tend to have this ambiguity in terms of like how I deal with folks, and never wanting to like take like a like I don't know, sometimes like I would live in this like in between where it was like okay, just not making a decision, not realizing that that was keeping me sometimes in like relationships that weren't good, or like in situations that weren't good. And like my therapist just saying like you're having this real ambiguous like kind of pattern that you're developing and that you're not breaking out of. And it was like really hard for me to think of like conflict as a good thing. um So I think that's what I think of when I think about how it's affected me. But definitely, like, the big thing is that pressure to be this perfect child, to be wanted. I think that's all there.
And Zyra.
Yeah, so I think like when you're a commodity of the state and your sole purpose is to meet the needs of others, I think you very quickly learn to comply and put your own needs on the back burner. And so I think, as a child, you're depending on adults to meet your basic needs. And so it's very difficult to have a say, to have autonomy. I mean, the very act of adoption strips you of any and all autonomy. And so for me, I often find myself questioning, like, if I'll ever be able to form a healthy attachment. I feel like I was robbed of any healthy attachments with my parents and family, and the people who the state gave me to certainly didn't model any type of healthy attachments. I feel like I didn't have, any type of boundaries, and the limited ones that I tried to set weren't respected at all, And when I think about like my career choices, it's interesting to like reflect back on this question. But when I think about my career choices, I've always found myself in like the helping, caretaking field. I used to work at a domestic violence shelter. I was a teacher. Now I work in mental health and recruiting, and so I think, my own experience with adoption and how I was raised was a large part of my decision also, like not to have kids outside of health reasons, because I just think about my own experience and it just becomes really overwhelming. And I'm just like, nah, I don't want any parts of that. I will happily take on my auntie role and do that, But in terms of my mental health, I feel like I've been struggling my whole life. I think when I can first remember was probably when I was about 10. And that's, I guess, a content warning here for suicidal ideation. But that was where those thoughts first started for me at 10 years old. And I didn't really know what to do with them, how to process them. And even though I was raised by Black people, as you may or may not know, mental health within the Black community is highly stigmatized. And so the response to me struggling with my mental health and being suicidal was that Black people don't commit suicide. And that was something that I was told at 10 years old, and I'm 30 now. And that has stuck with me all this time, And so I think a lot of the ways that adoption affected me have just been absolutely horrible. Like, there's really no, in my experience, I don't really have anything positive that I feel like came out of it. I feel like it took, like I mentioned earlier, like it took everything from me. And something else that I know you mentioned in here was talking about spiritually. Like, I was raised in a very strict religious home. We went to church every week. I didn't have a say. There were activities I had to participate in. Like, there was no forming my own opinion. There was none of that, And so as an adult, I feel like I've been on this journey to really figure out who the hell I am, which I feel like I'll never figure out because of adoption. But I think to try to get to a place that's more authentic and not living for other people, living for the approval of the people who adopted me, or like any of that, which I feel like a lot of times with trauma, you form these coping mechanisms to help you survive. And so a lot of my adulthood has been trying to unlearn a lot of those coping mechanisms that I no longer need, and reminding myself that I am in fact my own person, and that I can make choices, and that I can trust myself, and trying to live in such a way that's authentic to what I feel like who I should be.
Okay, so I'm gonna moderate, and then folks can piggyback if they like. And I think, like, I wrote it in bold, and I have felt like this, that like in different ways we've all talked about this like kind of delay when it comes to how it's impacted us. And like I think about, like, I don't know if you folks go through this, but like you have your friends who haven't been adopted or been in the system, and like, yeah, most families have something going on, but I feel like there's just basic ways we're constantly having to deal with something that happened back then in a way I don't find other people are having to, whether that's health information. I feel like while folks were talking too around, and Harrison, I've read your book, Zara, we've chatted, Ash, we're close. So I have different pieces of information, and like the way, and I hate to bring it back to health, but it's just for folks because adoption tends to really lean on notions of health to justify the adoption. In fact, the way I grew up and the way that I've at least heard and know folks who have grown up on this panel the way our health, whether that be mental health or physical, wasn't taken seriously. So I remember experiencing particular, and like I was adopted into a house where there was a white boy who was adopted. Anything happened with him, we're at the hospital. We've got a counselor. We've got, probably shouldn't have been medicated. It was very problematic, but we've got you medicated, and like I have very serious health issues that even as an adult, I'm having to learn how to navigate in the context of being an adult. So, as an adult, people will say, set boundaries, take a step back, but it's just like, well, I don't know how to do that in the context of who this person that I've built myself to be, because I never was taught, well, I can't do this for my health, right? And so the way in which, like, as adults, we're then having to, like, and that can have impacts, right? Like, maybe we have to make a big career decision. Well, that's pretty huge. That, like, other people don't have to make that kind of decision because they grew up maybe knowing their health needs or having support in that. It's funny, you talk about coming into the fog or pressure. Like, I remember in January, after getting more of my CAS file that like sent me into a rage, I remember I was just Googling and this like image, and it said adoptees, and it said hypervigilance, perfectionism, and I just control D and exited the page. I was like, we will circle back to that, right? I was like, but like, and like folks talk about perfectionism sometimes as this haha thing, but like the way perfectionism actually impacts your body, not just anxiety, but I noticed that like I don't breathe properly, as you all can kind of hear while I'm talking. And that's just because of like this like hypervigilance, hyperventilation, but I've just learned to go about my day like that. Just basic ways that like even the hypervigilance, like we had to be in households monitoring the people around us to survive, to fit in, or maybe we didn't even care to fit in. We just wanted to be fed and not be bullied that day. And so the way in which like then navigating public life, I'll be sitting down with a meal and my friends will notice my eyes are going everywhere. And it's a struggle to quote unquote control. And so the various way, and then like I hear you folks talking, and this is an ongoing problem in my life, and Ash knows this. Romantic relationships, personal relationships are very difficult. I do find it hard to translate, especially because I think we're all often seen as like that, like, oh, you're great, you the accolades, you do this, you do that. And so it's hard for people to again translate or ignore that or put that aside and see that like we are crumbling, we are struggling, we're exhausted, but it doesn't look like that to someone else. And so I've even heard like people be like, well, for example, I've gone through reunion with respect to like my biological side of on my father's side, and there was someone who said, well, like now you can leave that in the past. And I was like, well, unfortunately, my body won't let me. And in fact, every time I try to pretend like I've left it in the past, it rears its ugly head. And I get it. And and then we're in these positions with these close relationships of like, we know they didn't mean it that way, but now it's just another way in which it's like, okay, well, do I just carry this story in my throat now and not talk to you about it? Well, that's how I lived. That's how I grew up. I often say to people, like, I feel like I'm suffocating often. Like that's how I feel. I'll stop there. Is there anyone who wants to hop in, chime in?
Like I have a bunch more stuff to say, but I don't want to just jump in.
Go ahead. We got an hour and we only got one question left.
Yeah, well, I was thinking about like my medical needs not going acknowledged. Not that long ago I had a friend who was going through nursing school, and there was like one of her classmates came over to our place and we were all talking, and she said to me, well, Black people don't feel pain. I was like, I'm sorry, what? Like, is that, and it turns out like that's something that she's heard, but I realized that I had heard that growing up. I heard that from my adoptive family. And I think about like, in my book, I talk about breaking my ankle, but I had like sprained my other ankle multiple times. And, we never actually went to the doctor or to the hospital or anything to deal with that. And I realized like, that's what my mom said. It was like, oh, well, you don't feel it. I was like, well, I'm pretty sure I do feel it. And by the time I got to adulthood, like I was just so used to ignoring everything about my body and my needs, that when I met my current partner, like the litany of stuff that she just like would make a doctor's appointment for me for, and it would clear up forever, was remarkable. It was like I was just thinking about it while you were talking. It was like, okay, so like I needed hernia surgery and ADHD meds and antidepressants and something to clear up my dermatitis and like just all these things. And I hadn't done any of these things. And when, you know, she was like, well, why don't you just go to the doctor? I was like, what are you talking about? Like, I don't go to the doctor. I don't, you know, engage with what I actually need. And yeah, it turns out like I learned that at home, in a place where like the people who raised me told me that I didn't feel pain. Um, yeah, I feel like that's, you know, I was thinking about that and then just that idea of being authentic. It's like, yeah, how do I even know what's mine anymore when, you know, all of my thoughts about how to take care of me and live in my own body came from somebody else and were stupid ideas, you know? I'll find myself listening to music now and then just halfway through a song, like, wait a minute, I don't fucking like this. Like, what makes me think I like this, you know? And like obviously it was yeah, my upbringing, and they were like, that's good music. And you're like, that is good music. You know, and then you find yourself listening to just the worst songs. Again, I could go and go. I'm sorry. I want to say too that I like every time that I'm in the room or in conversation with other adoptees, I just find it so friggin' revelatory. Like it's just you know, it feels like, you know, in the same way that I was kept from like so much black thought, black philosophy, just like, you know, black consciousness, like I was kept, consciously kept from adoptee consciousness. And you know, you get it when you talk to others and you hear it's like, well, you have all the same problems, like really all the same problems. Yeah, it makes me angry. But yeah, just so delighted to be talking to you guys and hearing your stories. It makes me feel like I exist.
Well, I'm glad because we hold one another. Does anyone else want to chime in? I think one of the things that you said, and like to hone in on again, because like, for folks, like there's the CAS system will try to base things off of like basic needs. Is that kind of, you know, at least for myself, and I definitely resonate with that, like the anti-black dissociation of the body. And like, you know, I tell my like it's fun. I don't know if it's a thing where the light skinned kids are spraining their ankles and having to drive themselves to the hospital, but that happened for me. Like it was just no question that I would drive myself to the hospital. Like I remember I cut my hand to the bone and my adoptive mother refused to drive me to the hospital. And my adoptive father let that fly. So I had to wait to the next morning when they went to work, and I went across the street to my best friend's house and I was just like, hey, can you bring me to the hospital? She's like, why? And I showed her my hand and I love her. She was like, your fucking mother. And so I was just like, you know, I was just like, and that's it. And that was one of the moments where I was like, because I thought this was a normal thing. Like I literally just put a band-aid on it. When I arrived to the hospital, they were like, if you did not come any sooner, like you could have lost your finger because of where the cut was. Um, and like, you know, I don't know if you folks experience this, but I find that often as an adult, I am struggling to articulate what's happening with my body. So, you know, one time I was in the hospital and they were like, can you describe the pain? I was like, it hurts. They're like, but is it like a sharp pain, a warm pain, dull pain, throbbing pain? I'm like, baby girl, I did not know I was going to fail a multiple choice test today at the hospital at St. Mike's. Like, what do you mean? And so
Mm.
the way it's like, and then that impacts the kind of service you get, and then also the decisions you make. Like recently I dislocated my shoulder and, you know, I was in the back of the ambulance and it was so painful, but I was refusing to like let it stay out, and I was trying to put it back in myself, and the paramedic was shocked. He was like, most people can't even do that, and I was just there pulling it. And I know it's a part of like this capacity to like dissociate in the moment to try to get whatever needs to be done, and it has huge impacts then lifelong, right? Like we can be stuck with something that for other people would be basic to address, but it can just, you know, it can just massicize into other kinds of issues. And then, of course, we're there to deal with it. And if we bring it up to our adoptive family that we're here because of what was done to us, they say that we're guilting them and we're blaming them for a decision we should have made as an adult. So, you know, there's the many ways in which it rears its ugly head.
Yeah,
Is there any more hopping? Oh, go ahead.
just interested in that image of you trying to put your arm back in. Like that really, that feels like so much of this, right? And you know, the sense that like if I don't do this for me, no one is going to do this for me. You know, so it's like, oh yeah, well, my arm's out. Like, I guess I'd better figure out how to put it back in, or it'll just stay out. You know, even when you're like with the paramedics, like their job is to put you're with the arm putter backers, and you're like, I better do this.
Mhm.
Yeah, I can't even tell you how many times I've found myself with the people whose job is to help me with the problem, and I'm still 100% convinced that it is only my problem and no one will help me. Um, yeah.
And I find it in like, the situation with my shoulder, again, because it is in this conversation of adoption, you know, having been reunited with my birth family on my father's side, like the Black aunties were showing up and actually showing care. Meanwhile, my white adoptive mother sent me a message about like a savings account that you can do for like buying a house, right? They never like, I'm having food and care offered to me, and like I struggle to even accept the offer because I'm not used to it. I'm like, no, like they've got Uber Eats for this, or like, yeah, I've dislocated shoulders before, so I actually know how to cook with one hand. Like a lot of people are like, how are you doing? I'm like, oh girl, I've been through this. This is like, I even have notes on how to deal with this. And so like, even in the moment of maybe we are receiving care, like how it's just so starkly different from what we experienced growing up, that like then I'm like, am I asking for too much? Should I be asking for anything? Is this all that I accept? What do I give in return? Like there's even the part in your brain where it's just like, should I be transactional with this? Because growing up, nothing was unconditional, right? So I like, even in the context of care, how it impacts experiencing care from those we care about and do love and love us. Before I shift to question 3, is there any more hopping in?
Yeah, I just wanted to hop in real quick.
Yeah.
But Josh, whenever you were talking about, when they ask you, is it dull, sharp? When I tell you I cannot stand that question when I go to the doctor, because I'm like, I don't know how to answer it. And it's like, one time I went to the hospital and, my best friend was there to support me. And she was like, what do you mean? I'm like, I don't know. Like, do you know how to answer this question? Do you know how to describe your pain? Like, because I don't know how to do it. And I don't think that I realized until you said it that like this is something that other folks who are adopted have dealt with. This whole time I just was like, maybe it's just me and my neurodivergence. Like, I don't know. um, but yeah, so that's been really challenging, but also even in terms of like I think I experienced similar things to y'all, like when you were kids and just not being taken to the doctor and things like that. But I even think about medical history when it comes to, being a survivor of the family policing system, because a lot of times you don't have access to any of that. And one of the first, you go to the doctor's office and you fill out some paperwork and they ask you for your family history. And what do you have to put there? Nothing, right? And they typically don't have options to check unknown or adopted. The first time I saw that was last year. I went to an orthopedic doctor and they had a checkbox for unknown and they had a checkbox for adopted. And I remember I took a picture of it and I posted it on Twitter because I just was so shocked that they had something like that. And it's so small, like you would think that they would do stuff like that more often, but of course they're not thinking about that. Why, if you've never had to think about it? Something that I experienced a couple years ago is I found out that two of my biological sisters, one of them was like actively dealing with cancer, and the other one, she had cancer when she was much younger. And so because of this, I went to my primary care doctor, who was a Black woman. I tried to explain it to her, and I was prepared to like fight her about it. And she was like, well, we're going to get you some genetic testing done. And so we were able to do that and figure out if I had these certain markers and things like that. And I was like super grateful for that. But I also recognize that's a privilege because not everybody is connected to their family to even know that information. And for a lot of doctors and medical professionals, they're unwilling to do any of the testing. And like, oh, you don't know it? Okay, like you're good. Instead of thinking, let's just test you for everything because you don't know anything, And so there's all these like rights and things that we just don't have access to, that we're not afforded, and just yet another situation where we're seen as less than, because we're adopted.
Mhm. Yeah, circling back to that idea of loss, I'm blown away how many of us have like the loss of a language to describe our pain. To borrow a term from Bell Hooks, that's just something that like again, it blows me away. It's like, oh yeah, so none of us can articulate like what this feeling is, and like, yeah, again, I know a lot of nurses, and they'll be like, okay, like how much does it hurt? You're like, I don't know, enough that I noticed. And then they're like, okay, well, yeah, dull, sharp, like beats me, like it's just there. And then, even like they'll ask like, okay, from 1 to 10. And I find even that one, it's like, according to whom, like I don't actually have like the grounding to understand, like, do you mean a universal one? Do you mean my one? Because my 1 and my 10 could be the same. Like, there's no way of knowing what's going on in my body until it comes out, like just, oh, I'm bleeding. I guess I'm hurt. Like, I feel like that loss of language as a symptom is just, it's so fascinating. And again, so maddening. And you see the ways that leads to all kinds of negative outcomes down the road. It's like, well, we can't even articulate our needs because we can't even, articulate them to ourselves. We can't recognize what's going on, within our own bodies. It seems unfair, friends. It seems very unfair.
And I feel like, one of the things that I then experience is like somehow I'm irresponsible for not being able to answer these questions. Like I've done something wrong. And I actually find that it's in these moments, and especially dealing with health, that I feel like I've said to people that I feel like I feel infantile. I just feel like there is like, that's when you said it's maddening, then I get in on myself, like, I didn't know I was supposed to be able to answer that. The scaling question 1 to 10, I've even had doctors be like, most people would say this is a 10. I'm like, well, 10 would be dead. No, like what do you mean? like
Yeah.
I'm like, I'm gonna stick with a solid 7 because I feel like there is a little bit of up from here, and so,
Everything's a 7 for me. Yeah.
right, like, and
7, I don't know.
right, and I also think about like, for folks who are listening in the context of adoption, you might assume, well, doesn't your health information get told? Nowadays, they would say, yes, that's not true. Because at the end of the day, everything relies on an individual social worker who decides what to document, how to document, and then what to present to the court for the judge to say, yes, this adoption can go through. So for me, I have epilepsy, which wasn't diagnosed until 2021. I've been having seizures since I was like 6. And, I didn't find out until I reunified with my birth mother that CAS knew that my birth mother had seizures, multiple seizures. I've grown up always thinking that people breathe the way that I breathe. I found out in February that I've only been using 35% of my lungs. Turns out that on my biological father's side, there's asthma. And so the ways, but then, like, even if that information is given to the adoptive family, this assumption that people know how to deal with other people's health, right? This assumption that these parents know that, when I was having my seizures, that doesn't mean my adoptive parents knew how to help me. They didn't. In fact, what they did in those situations often made it worse. And frankly, were caused because of them, because they're stressful. And so again, within all of this conversation of health and ambiguity, and then here we as adults, and when I can't even answer a scale of 1 to 10, like, damn, what do you mean? Now, and then guess what? Another thing we have to unpack in therapy.
Yeah.
like yeah, you know what, I gotta say, at least we keep our therapists in business. Like they know they got a lifetime client.
Yeah, no, I think about, my son has my brain, right? So in my house there's a lot of forgiveness for, his distractibility and his inattentiveness and his his rejection sensitivity and just all of these things. And I realized that, that's because like he is being raised with a context for who he is. Like I see myself in him. I see, like, I have a lifetime of strategies for dealing with, my own issues and for, at least in some ways insisting on making space for myself. And, so when he goes through these things, like not only do I know how to handle them, but like I know to cherish them as something that we share. you know, and so much of my childhood was just being bewildering to my parents because yeah, they have no context for who I am. You know, my biological mom was exactly like me. And, you know, I just think about how much better off I would have been in a place, even under the table at a Denny's, with somebody who recognized all of these traits in me, and had, you know, love for them or strategies for how to deal with them, you know, instead of just kind of reacting like she's never met anyone like this, you know. Yeah, again, maddening.
So, with that being said, we're going to transition into the last question. So, for folks, I'm going to put this last question in the chat. And then if you have questions, you can start typing them in now, and putting them in. I do ask that you type them. Just, you know, I know folks might want to chime in with the question in the comment. Maybe if we have time, but I'd like to keep it if you can just put the question in the chat. So question 3, it has a preamble. So the preamble says, a lot of adoption research argues that transracial adoption and same-race adoptions are successful based on the adjustment of the child. Findings that are made often through using parents as participants rather than speaking to child and adult adoptees. A significant aspect of what justifies this finding of success is looking at factors such as the adopted child's education level, family and friend relationships, and reports on self-esteem. Preamble. So the question asks, based on your experiences as an adoptee, do you think the language of adjustment and factors like education level and parent and self-reports made as a child are accurate representations of how successful your adoption was? And Ash is going to start us off.
So yeah, I think when I was thinking about this, I thought about just even like the fact that adoption's always thought of as like this like happy ending and like that's the end and like you wipe your hands and then everybody's good. And we know that, you know, it's not funded the same way. We know that there's not a lot of supports that are given to families after. I don't think these reports are always accurate. Like I think I had some check-ins with like a worker like maybe 6 months after, and then they like sort of faltered out. And I think it would be really interesting to see like what would have happened had somebody come to like check in like maybe like 2 years after or like 3 years after. Um, because I think, you know, you at least for me, because when I was 12 and I made the choice to kind of be adopted, you know, I was in survival mode. Like I was trying to get out of my foster home. I was trying to get out of the system. And so I was making a decision in survival mode, which wasn't necessarily like a choice or like an informed decision. It was like just a lot of coercion and not really understanding the decision I was making. And so, like I think if you had talked to me kind of really shortly after my adoption, you would have thought like, oh yeah, like she's doing great. Like, wow, she's in a home or like she can like, you know, move around maybe a bit more freely or like, you know, have access to certain things like in a way that I didn't in my foster home. And like, so I would have told you like, you know, it was at least at that time, at least a success. And I remember my like youth and transition worker at that time kept being like, slow down. She was like, slow down, like take a minute, like think about what you're doing and like really think through like if you're like okay with this. And I just remembered like not listening to her. And now years later, just realizing what she was trying to tell me, which was really like I think trying to warn me, I think of what was gonna come, which was that, you know, and I've heard it from a lot of adoptees that I know is that there tends to be this like moment where I think it all hits you. Um, and that can happen for many people at different times, but there's this moment where like it all starts coming back to you and like you start trying to grapple with some of these things. And at that moment, you're like, I think just out of the guise of like any of that oversight that would happen. So yeah, I don't know. And then when I think of education level, like, I don't know, personally, like, I think I was always really intelligent. And I think that's never gonna be like something that like came out of my adoption or not. Like, I think that would have happened like regardless. So like, if you look, as me, as a person now, who's educated, who's a lawyer, who's doing well for herself and what that looks like, stereotypically, like you would say, oh, she's a success story. But I don't think that would take into account like all the other things that we've been talking about today. So no, I don't think like, the studies are very accurate. I think if you talk to folks, the way we're talking now, having a discussion like this, like, would that be a better representation? I think so.
Okay, thank you. Zaira?
Yeah, so I mean, for me, I think when I think about, I thought it was an interesting question. So when I think about adjustment, I think about like you're trying to like fit into something. And when I think about it that way, like I really don't think that you could be further from the truth. I don't think that it's a good word or uh measurement tool to use. I was never meant to be in this family to begin with. My mom deserved the opportunity to raise all five of her kids. And I think I didn't have any type of self-reporting as a child, but I think it feels unfair because I think back like to when I was a child, I don't know that I would have been honest knowing that I'd have to deal with the repercussions of that, knowing that I'd have to go back to that home and deal with the aftermath of that, right? Which could potentially be getting abused. And so I don't know if that would have been like helpful per se. And then I mean, I think in terms of education, like personally, I don't think it's everything. I think by all means, I'm probably considered successful because I have a bachelor's degree. And the stats say that kids in foster care aren't supposed to graduate from high school, let alone college. So yeah, sure. But I think at the end of the day, for me, a degree and a diploma never healed my broken heart and grief that I deal with because I was separated from my family. So I don't think that adjustment or some of these sort of arbitrary things that really don't tell the whole story of who a person is and what their experience was like, I don't think it's a fair assessment or a fair tool or word to use to determine what success looks like.
And Harrison.
Yeah, adjustment's a weird word to use here, isn't it? Like I can fit into a suitcase, I suppose, if I adjust myself accordingly. And I did for most of my life, right? I just crammed myself into this metaphorical suitcase, made it fit. Like I feel like we strain to belong, and then like mid-strain, we were asked by a researcher, like, hey, little Billy, like, he's down on one knee, like, how's your adoption going? And like, your adoptive parents are right behind you, like, tell him the truth, Billy. Like that's not a safe space to answer this question, and it's also not like a realistic space to expect a child to be able to answer this question. Um, yeah, it honestly seems like any data from like minors when it comes to adoption, it's like, well, I don't think all the facts are in yet. And then yeah, like you talk to adoptees as an adult, and like anyone who's actually willing to talk about it with you is typically someone who's kind of come out of that fog now. So you have these conversations, and yeah, I think the anecdotal evidence suggests, the qualitative analysis suggests that this has been pretty bad for us. And obviously, adoption is not really done with our interests in mind. It's done to meet a very particular need that has very little to do with us. So it makes sense that they would prioritize, our naive childhood answers, over the accounts that we can give with a full accounting of the facts. So yeah, like I don't feel like any of those reports are accurate. I don't feel like they're reflective of me or my experience. And if you've read my book, like that I got just the stupidest education imaginable. Like it was ridiculous. Like dropped out and nobody noticed. So I got a high school diploma. Like, yeah, I feel like often education is I mean, it's something that you can fake. I don't think that it has a whole lot to do with intelligence. You know, it's a matter of being given the language of intelligence. You know, can you sound like you got a degree? Like that's about all you need. So, you know, I feel like, yeah, there wasn't really anything that I got there. Like people want to talk about my education. Like, no, I did that mostly on my own. You know, I taught myself how to read. You know, I went back to college without my family giving me any help whatsoever. You know, I got my degrees on my own. You know, in spite of them, like often, you know, in spite of them insisting that you know, getting a liberal arts degree or going to a secular school was a bad thing to do. You know, so yeah, they didn't really help me there either. So yeah, I mean, I feel like often the language around adoption is just so, you know, kind of like willfully ignorantly framed. And you know, when it comes to that kind of analysis, yeah, it's I think it's just pure foolishness.
Period.
And that's on period.
So my last, I guess, moderator moment. So while you folks are talking, you know, obviously I'm taking notes. And I think what's interesting, and obviously like this has been a part of my conclusion, is that like it's interesting that really this research doesn't get at the emotional language of children, right? Like one of the things that I've thought about, and again, because I kind of see what everyone posts, or sometimes we talk, or you know, is the way that researchers don't want to actually look into how children see their world. So like, why is it a bunch of adoptees tend to like gravitate towards narratives where the child's parent is missing? Why is it the adoptees seem to love superhero movies where or shows where, you know, the main character is willing to die for everyone even if everyone hates them, right? And so like what does that mean in terms of how a child sees themselves in a narrative? Or like for myself, you know, I when I watch Scandal, like why do I gravitate towards like Olivia Pope? You know, when I watch How to Get Away with Murder, I know that, okay, you know what? I don't mind telling on myself. You know, here I am, Anna's Keating, but all of these characters make sense to me. And so like, why is it these people make sense to me? And how is it I see myself in these narratives? And I feel like in the context of education being a marker, you know, Harrison, you kind of said it, like I remember distinctly being like 11 or 12 and being like, oh, like these white people are going to be no help in my
Yes.
like I just realized that. And for folks, just so you know, research does show that like adoptions where the child ends up being more intelligent than the adoptive parents, they're more likely to break down, right? So I remember even being smarter than like my parents' extended family, because these weren't exactly brilliant white people. And so like being in these spaces where I was like taught to I hate using this language, but dumb myself down. But also, Harrison, kind of what you said, and I'm sure for most of us, education was the ticket out of these houses and out of these towns. Like I remember grade 10, I made a very specific decision. I read every single college pamphlet when they were physical, and I realized scholarships are how I get out, and my grades took a 180, right? That so before that, that meant they were bad. I don't think that meant I was less intelligent. I just wasn't playing the education game. And so I think the way that these markers that are used for success, they don't realize that, like including the language of adjustment, these are just tactics of survival and getting out, and have very little to do with like what these folks taught us. Like I'm sure most of us, like if we had to sit in a room with our adoptive parents while we all talk, our adoptive parents would sit there on their hands not knowing what to say, because our conversations outpace maybe what their worldview is. And you know, I think something else that stuck out to me was again, like I think the importance of like the emotion, like being brokenhearted, the like even Harrison, you saying like I would rather be sleeping under a table at Denny's where I'm being held emotionally.
Mhm.
I think this is what has given this system so much power, which is in fact our what who can actually hold us emotionally. If these white people, if these adoptive parents were actually assessed for their capacity to hold us specifically emotionally, they would not have passed the measure. But instead economic, right? And this assumption that, well, if he can go in a program, if you can be in this, then, well, it must be emotionally good. It's like, well, no, often we're put in programs with kids who don't like us, especially if we don't look like them, right? And also, like, kids are generally shit towards one another. Like, it's rough out here. So it's like we're put in these spaces, but we just have this high capacity to adjust, or this coerced, as you said, Ash, this coerced capacity to adjust is what we have. And then that works against us. Because it's like, well, what else are we supposed to do? Are we all supposed to like fall apart as children? And then maybe you'll be like, oh shit, this doesn't work. Right. And that loops back to the fact that, again, there was a researcher in the 1950s who said you cannot research this idea of success. It is not possible to have this measure. With that being said, is there anyone who else wants to hop in before we do a little wrap up? Actually, wait, no, there's a question. I'm dead. Does anyone want to hop in? Okay, so I've got, the question says, thinking of how prison abolition is a multi-pronged dismantling of the prison industrial complex and not an instant systemic collapse, how can we approach adoption abolition individually in our social circles, collectively in our communities, and systemically in our institutes? Anyone want to hop in on this? Harrison, you're on mic, so I'm gonna throw it at you.
I like, it's just such a huge question, right? And it's funny because like it is kind of I feel like it's like I feel like when I do readings, white people will ask me this question in a hostile way, right? Like, well, what will you do to fix it? And like here, like, oh, what a great question. Like this is exactly what everyone should ask it this way. From now on, ask it this way. I mean, like, I don't know. I feel like, yeah, like the one thing that I know that I can do is like not just insist on telling my story, but insist on everyone telling their stories. Like this, the only way that we even begin to dismantle the rhetoric around adoption is by, building our own discourse. So, one of the goals with Invisible Boy was to give young me, who I imagine exists all over the place. There are so many versions of me out there. Seems like maybe I'm talking to 3 of them right now. To give young me the language to actually tell this story and to reclaim, their own story. So, like I feel like there's big work to be done here. There's big organizing work. And I am not an organized person. But I know that the thing that I can do is talk incessantly, maybe too much, and encourage other people to do the same. Like, no, like as we've established here, like in many ways, we have lost our voices. We are struggling to recover our voices, and I think that the work that I'm really passionate about doing in this space is just like making it easier to talk about this stuff. It seems like as we do, like we really build a critical mass here, and we offer that anecdotal evidence, to overturn or abolish this system. So I mean, I think that's the work that I can do. But I mean, even like this organization, when I like agreed to do this panel, it was like survivors. Like, am I a survivor? Like the word felt it felt transgressive to me, but like as I thought about it, it was like, yeah, like absolutely I am. And I'm so excited to just kind of join work that's already in progress. I'm excited to find it, but really excited to join it, and just contribute whatever I can, so that we can kind of all get free together. I mean, that's, I guess, my response to this massive question. But Shar, I just want you to know I'm going to be thinking about this question for a very long time.
I can chime in here. So, you asked about social circles, communities, and systemically in our institutes. So when I think about like social circles, I do think I agree with Harrison. I think storytelling is really important, but I also think that education is really important. And not necessarily that it's on us to educate folks, because I think that really becomes a problem. But I think it's really important for folks to be educated, and even not just about um, adoption in our stories, but also being educated about how child protective services, how investigators work, right? So that folks are able to know their rights. Like when somebody shows up at your door, you don't have to let them in if you don't want to, right? They don't have a warrant. Like being able to understand those things and know those things, so that if someone finds themselves in a situation like that, or if they know somebody who's going through that, because I don't know the stats off the top of my head, but the stats in the United States around the number of Black children who will face an investigation, right? They're alarming. And so that the education piece is something that's really important. When I think about communities, I think about grassroots organizations that are on the ground doing the work. Find an organization and get involved with them, whether that be a food pantry organization, whether that be an organization. There's an organization in Chicago called Aunties on Call that if somebody needs support with someone, you can call someone from that organization. Maybe you just need a break, maybe you need a grocery shop, whatever the case may be. They will step in and try to help support you in that way. There's other organizations out there like Movement for Family Power, just making a change for families. Um, Operation Stop CPS, which does a lot of education around how to interact with CPS and how to be informed about what to say, what not to say, to know what your rights are, things like that. And then within our institutes, I mean, I think there has to be, I think there's a growing collective of social workers who are abolitionists and who are calling, at least here in the States, for a lot of the language and the practices to be changed, because, you know, social workers, they take this oath that says this, that, and the third, which is basically to protect, and they're not doing that, right? They're active agents in separating children from their families. And so I think from an institutional perspective, they have to continue to build that collective, to build that power, and to put that pressure on these entities like the National Association of Social Workers or whatever, who's making all of these rules and putting out all these mandates and all these different things, putting the pressure back on them to hold up this decree or this oath that they take, because right now that's not what's happening. And there's one other thing I was going to say, but I just lost my train of thought. But I mean, I think like at the root of it, when it comes to the family policing system, a lot of times why these investigations are started are because of neglect, which is just a racialized term for poverty, for being poor. And so if we can figure out how to help sustain families and help meet their needs, then I think the system will inevitably collapse, because people won't be in these sorts of situations. Again, I'm going off the top of my head, but there's an organization in New York that started paying families. I think it was like like they gave them an additional $1,000 a month, and surprise, surprise, it helped. So people need money. People need money. They need support. They need resources. There's also like some work that needs to be done around some of the legislation. And again, speaking from a US context, because I'm based in the US, but repealing CAPTA here in the United States. There's a whole movement for that. The drug testing that takes place of babies and mothers that they use to build their case to separate children from their families. So there's some movement work around that as well. But yeah, that would be my answer for that.
Okay, Ash, do you have anything you wanna hop in with?
I mean, I feel like it's all been said, and I don't love to add things. I think it's just a really good way of asking that question. And I just like, I feel very grateful for like folks who have built spaces like this when they didn't exist. And, you know, when we conceived of CCWS, I think it was trying to fill this space. And it was radical for us to have this kind of, or what was thought to be radical to say, you know, we don't want to have certain relationships. We're thinking about things from an ethical standpoint. And it's really worked out for us, I think, in a lot of ways. And, you know, it's a risk to like go out there and do that, but there are folks doing this work. And I think it's important to, you know, support those folks, connect with those folks. And that's like the way I see it in community. And I think for me, being in a lot of like other groups with like with other folks who've been adopted has been such a space of like healing and like just knowing there are other people who like you don't have to explain things to in the same way and that they can understand, I think is a big way of just kind of I don't know if that's a part of abolition, but I think so. And I think I don't know, like I think there's a big part about like what do you do in a situation where like there is a child who has like doesn't have a relationship with their birth family for reasons of like, you know, maybe folks have passed or like I guess rethinking how we think about familial relationships, how we think of like nurturing children, how that can be done in a, you know, in a community like more community oriented way, in a way that keeps a child like within their community with their supports, like with extended family. I think those are all things like we need to be shifting towards. But yeah, I just think everybody are like covered everything already, so I'll stop there.
Okay, so I'll jump in with one last thing in this conversation. I think we also need, as this, like as a social world, but especially here in the quote unquote West, but to really reconsider how we think of children and like who is the child. How do we like, you know, there's the constant Twitter discourse of like people saying I hate children. It's just like, man, like that's huge red flag. Wouldn't date you. But like, you know, the way in which like when we talk about the abolition of, you know, family policing system, you know, and I'm pulling this forward for folks. So CCWS, we refuse to partner with any children's aid society. We won't do workshops for you. We will not hold your hand, because at this point, if folks were listening, this issue of overrepresentation of Black, Indigenous, and racialized youth is a century-long problem. If it's not solved by now, these people are not solving it. We're not giving you a training. You can use Google. You can go find a book, right? And for us, we considered that. Then we had like, and as Ash said, it's like this is a part of abolition. We had an intentional conversation to have that intentional decision, and it's one we stand by. Meanwhile, there were other youth groups who were, you know, maybe willing to lick a few boots, and now they've disappeared, right? They got their coins and then they cashed out. And I think, you know, what I'm hearing from folks too is like we have to be building lines of defense for ourselves, by ourselves, right? Like CCWS is developed, and, you know, kind of connecting to what Harrison said, it has been hard to conceptualize ourselves as adults and survivors. And like, you know, myself and one of our colleagues were talking about how like and this panel's just indicated that I'm still surviving. Like I'm still having to survive what happened here. And that's what's hard about this term survivors, because we're not out of it. But building lines of defense that also sounds like us. Like I've already probably sworn in this recording, and you know, when in the context of doing the work that we do, we don't police. You know, we obviously try to support families and parents and children and how they interact with these systems, but when these children and families show their humanness, including their rage and anger and everything that would get them diagnosed, we fight back against that, trying to pathologize and criminalize those people. I will say to workers, you're lucky this is all this parent said. I have had to say to a CAS worker, you're lucky when this parent rolled up on you in a parking lot, it didn't go any farther than that, right? And so how part of abolition in my eyes and the work that we're doing, and even was the point of this panel, is, you know, how do we see, hold, and view people differently than we are? Because when it comes to adoption and you know, and how these systems function, that doesn't happen, right? It loops back to what almost every panelist has said, which is this was never about us. This was about someone's demand for a child. And that's another thing. people need to rethink and think about why they want a child. And I don't mean that in a rude way. Are like, if you want a child, are you just there for the child's cute ears? How do you understand those cute ears? Right? Are you capable of parenting a teenager? If so, what happened to you when you were those years? Right? Kind of what Harrison was saying, like, what knee-jerk reactions do you have to unpack? And I think this is a whole part of this system too. And I say this not to put this on parents, but more so to think, again, this loops back to like, how do we understand children? Who is being a child for, right? So I'll stop there and leave with that. Given the time, thank you for the question, Char. For folks, you know, our amazing panelists we've posted about them on our social media. So for Harrison's book, yeah, reframing adoption as child trafficking. I just saw this comment. That's a good and important part of adoption abolition. But for folks, if you want to connect or find the work of our panelists, you can go to the social media posts that we've made for this event, and then you can connect there in terms of their podcasts or other kinds of work. And we are really thankful for you all coming out and staying out this late. I'm thankful for the panelists for staying up this late if it's late for you. And honestly, I'm leaving this space, you know, feeling more held and more seen. You know, Harrison, what you said, like, I think you saw, I had once posted on my Insta story, like your book and how I'd written in it.
Yes, I remember that. I think you were the first person to post about my book. Like, I really like this book. So
Yeah.
it's very formative for me because, you know, I need other people to tell me I'm good. I
Yeah,
don't,
well, see,
don't
we all need that, right? And that's it is like the affirmation on this panel. Like, I feel less mad, and I mean that in all the senses as I hear this, as much as I'm also enraged for us. And so I'll stop there, folks. If you want to connect with CCWS, Collective of Child Welfare Survivors, on social media, and again, if you know someone that needs support, whether that's individual advocacy or you want to connect with us in terms of workshops and other things, feel free to reach out. All right. Thank you and goodbye.
Thanks. Nice to meet you guys. Goodbye.